So this is the Congregational Vitality and Evangelism, and I am Reverend Tony Oltmann. I'm the associate at the Office of the Vital Congregations in Louisville, but I work deployed, which is a fancy term meaning I work remotely. So I'm in Minnesota most of the time, but travel around the country for this position and help presbyteries and congregations. Has anybody on Zoom or here, Cheryl, has anybody looked at the 8 Habits of Evangelism before?
Yeah.
No? Oh, okay, good. Good. Well, we will walk through the 8 Habits of Evangelism kind of briefly. Well, not just kind of briefly, very briefly, because it's so rich and so amazing. But we'll run through that. As I said, I'm with the Office of Vital Congregations, and I make up a third of the office. The other 2/3 are Marla Edwards. I always joke with my wife that it's Marlton, and someday I'm going to end up saying Marlton, and I did. Marla Edwards, she's our mission specialist, and she is, and that's a fancy term for basically like chief engagement officer, and chief encourager. She does an amazing job at connecting with people and an amazing job at encouraging people. She is just a wonderful person to work with, which is good because that's how most people engage with our office, is through her. And then Reverend Carlton Johnson, he is the coordinator for the Office of Vital Congregations, and he recently was promoted. So he has 2 positions now. He is the Associate Director for Theology, Formation, and Evangelism, TFE, as we call it. And he will remain the coordinator for the Office of Vital Congregations until we figure out what to do. We're not quite sure how things are going to work, but for now, he's going to have 2 roles, and he works alongside Ray Jones, Dr. Ray Jones, who is the director of TFE. And to put that in a little, help us define it a little bit better, we are part of the Presbyterian Mission Agency, the PMA, and so we're one of the branches underneath the PMA. So that's kind of how we fit in the structure of the denomination. So what does congregational vitality look like? Oftentimes we have trouble defining that as in itself. We aren't sure what congregational vitality looks like, or how it should look like, or how should we measure success, or how should we measure health of a congregation? Is it programming that we offer? Is it the effectiveness of our evangelism? I was helping a congregation once in a previous role, and somebody was telling me that on session, they were telling me that they believed that they should get one person to be on the evangelism committee and give that person a goal at getting so many people into the congregation in the next year. And if they didn't, then they'd find somebody else to fill that role for the next year, which was an interesting conversation to have. For some, it's mission trips or souls saved or numbers. We tend to look at vitality as the church, the big church worldwide. We tend to look at it through business lens. God doesn't always look at things in those terms. This is one of my favorite pictures that I've ever taken. This is a little maple tree that has sprouted in the gutter at a long-term care facility that I visited. And it might not look like the most hospitable location. It might not look like there's nutrients. It might not look like there's enough for a maple tree to grow in the gutter, but there was. Our version of vitality is sometimes a little different than what God's version of vitality is. And if you've ever been to Pennsylvania, they have boulder fields, and they're just giant fields of giant granite boulders that are feet deep. It's where the glaciers stopped during the ice ages. And there's a couple of places where you can look and you can see straight down. It's just deep. The rocks are huge and you can walk as far as you can. But there are a couple of trees that have managed to find root system enough to grow up through those rocks, up through the cracks of the granite boulders. It's amazing what God can do with life and with what we think may not work. So as we talk about congregational vitality, we talk about it in terms of the 7 marks. And we use the term marks intentionally because we don't like goals, or we don't like journeys, or it's hard to kind of define it even. But we use marks specifically because of the Gospel John, when it talks about Jesus coming back into the locked room where the disciples were after the crucifixion. And he came into the locked room and he showed them the marks, and they believed. And then Thomas said that he needed to see the marks. And these are, of course, the depictions of Thomas. And I really enjoy these depictions of Thomas more than the traditional one, because these have Thomas seeing the marks and being changed. And that's our goal. That's one of the end goals of congregational vitality, is to help people realize the marks of Christ. The marks that we bear to others are what changed them. And Paul talks about this too in Galatians 6:17. From now on, don't let anyone trouble me with these things, for I bear on my body the marks that show I belong to Christ. So it's not necessarily what we offer in worship or offer at our congregation. It is more about what we bear, the marks that we bear to others. As we continue, I want to just share real briefly about my family, and this will make sense as we get going, because I share a little bit about my family, and so you just kind of need to know a little bit of background about us. Like I said, I live in Minnesota. I live in a small town of 2,200 people. We have a single stoplight, and on my street there are 5 houses. We overlook a lake, but we don't have access to it. So we have a nice view, but with no access. So it's nice to look at. Nice view from our living room. This is my wife, Kristen. We've been married for 15 years almost, and our son Kyle, who's 11 and going into 6th grade. We spend a lot of time outdoors, doing what we can. And then that's our dog, Schroeder. And Schroeder, in that middle picture on the bottom, is sleeping in my desk drawer of my office. He likes to sleep there in the winter months. And then I will actually lift that blanket up over him and cover him up. And he likes to just hide in there. And if he's curled up just the right way, I can actually open the drawer and on top of him, but that doesn't happen too often. So like I said, we like to spend time outdoors, doing different activities, being on the water. It has its benefits being in lake country. We have 300 lakes in our county, and it's where half the Twin Cities comes on the weekends during the summer. I really enjoy working with my hands, and I use a lot of hand tools and do a lot of woodworking. But I really just, since my son was born, really like doing things with him, and that's him in the bottom there, putting together a wiffle ball backstop that we made for his birthday party, because he had a wiffle ball tournament for his birthday party. And we really enjoy just kind of doing things around the house and working with our hands, and just anything we can do to spend time together. It's a lot of fun. But there is the downside of Minnesota, and that is the winter. When winter comes, I can't really do a lot of things around the house. So I turn inside to my indoor workshop, which is cooking. And I love cooking. Part of it comes from growing up in a big family where my mom, and I joked about this in presbytery, but it's true. My mom would say that if you complained about food, you got to cook the next meal. And I learned how to cook because I didn't learn how to not complain. So I learned how to cook. And then when I moved out on my own, I needed a way to not eat frozen food anymore. And I wanted to impress this really cool woman I was dating, who ended up becoming my wife. So I learned how to cook. And I still am the cook in the family. And I share about the cooking in part to share who I am a little bit, but also because Vital Congregations is a little like a recipe, a little like cooking, I should say, not necessarily a recipe, because with the traditional recipe, we get the exact measurements and you're supposed to do exactly what it says in the recipe. And that can be good, but everybody has a different taste and doesn't always work the same. So as I was thinking about it, it's not really like cooking a recipe, it's more like being on a cooking show. And sometimes church can feel like we're on his cooking show, but really it's more like this cooking show, Chopped. I like Chopped. I don't know how they turned cooking into such an intense show, but they have managed to turn it into an intense show. And it is fabulous. Does everybody here know? Well, I think I'll just go ahead and go to the next slide and have it explain it.
We are gearing up for another amazing culinary fight here. Just as you may recall, there are 3 rounds: appetizer, entree, and dessert. Each course has its own basket of mystery ingredients, and you must use every ingredient in the basket in some way. Also available to you, our pantry and fridge. The judging criteria: presentation, taste, creativity. If your dish doesn't cut it, you will be shocked. Top champions, please open your baskets. And your appetizers must include fruitcake, shad roe, vodka, and Tokyo scallions. 20 minutes on the clock. Time starts now.
So the premise of the show is that for every course that they must cook, the appetizer, the dinner, the main course, and the dessert, they're given a basket of 5 random ingredients, and they have to make a dish that uses all of the ingredients. It doesn't say how much, but you are supposed to use at least some of every ingredient. And this is an actual ingredient box that they had, and I think it was for a main course, and that's cucumber, kimchi, which has been liquefied and pureed, rice, a specific kind of rice, I don't remember, and then nutria, which is a large rodent, basically a large rat. And they had to make a main course out of it. We don't have those weird ingredients, thankfully. We have the 7 marks. So the goal of VCI is to take the 7 marks and give them to congregations and presbyteries and say, here are the 7 marks that we have decided, that we feel are a part of a healthy congregation, of a vital congregation. And each congregation then, each presbytery goes back and says, okay, how much of this ingredient do we need? How much caring relationships do we need? How much outward incarnational focus do we need? And get to decide based on where the neighborhood is and how God is calling you to that neighborhood and what the needs are. So it's not going to work the same for every congregation or every presbytery.
That is not what I expected you to say, Tony.
It isn't?
I thought you were relating those ingredients to the unusual mix of people we might need to make sure to include in our ministry so they don't feel
okay.
With a youth ministry background, I can relate to sometimes that's being a challenge, but
yes,
important.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it is about, because, VCI is not the expert. The presbytery is not the expert on the neighborhood or anything. And so the idea is to equip congregations and presbyteries with the tools to become vital themselves, because we can't tell anybody what to do. And we wouldn't want to, because we're not the experts on where you guys are. I did hear from a executive presbyter a few weeks ago who said that they had been in contact with a consulting group, and it was $50,000 to start, and then $5,000 for every congregation that wanted to join on to their vitality program. And ours is not something that we can modify or want to. We want to help and guide and create. There are other resources out there that can tell you what to do, but we would rather partner with people. So, and then these are the 7 marks. And I know in discussions with Cheryl and others in the presbytery, you guys have talked about these at length in presbytery meetings. So if they're familiar to you, good, because we're not going to spend any time on them, really. We're going to focus on the third one. Now in VCI, Vital Congregations, we define evangelism, or Mark 2, sorry. I said Mark 3 earlier. Sorry about that, it's Mark 2. I thought it was a little strange. Anyway, so we have intentional, authentic evangelism. And as a further example of not telling people what to do, we don't even define what the marks are. We define what they are not. So it's oftentimes evangelism can look like complacent Christian piety. So it's not that, where people are content just to be holy, just content to be prayerful. It's not simply teaching good morals. The Bible has some moralistic teachings in it, but it is more about a communal guide than an individualistic moral guide. And it's not about offering the latest programs, whether that's one church I was at, we were doing, it was a smaller church of about 50 people, and we had a pub theology that was going great. 12 to 15 people would show up monthly outside of church for a pub theology. And the bigger church down the road got wind of it, and they wanted to start offering words and wine because they thought it would be a good way to get people in too. So it's not just about offering the latest programs or competing with the church down the road. It's a little bit more than that. And thankfully, we've been given a good guide. If you haven't heard of the 8 habits of evangelism, it's okay. It's fairly new, and unfortunately, it's a underrepresented or under-discussed resource that we have in the Presbyterian Church, and it's a free resource online. You could go to 8habits.org and the number 8 and then habits.org and go to the website. And while we have booklets here, all of the information is online for free. You can download the entire booklet and print it off, or sections that you want. And it's absolutely an amazing resource. And one of the reasons they developed it is because things have really changed in the last few years. Not to mention, the last 10 years or the last 50 years, last 150 years, but definitely the last 2 to 3 years, things have really changed. And it was an intentional effort to talk about evangelism in light of the seismic shifts of economic change, of social change, political change, all sorts of changes. And so it was an intentional effort by the denomination to offer some guides. And the 8 habits are those that you see on your screen now: radical welcome, worship, sacraments, prayer, justice, teaching, fellowship, and generosity. They're not new. They're not radical. They're not out there. They're tried and true habits. And they went with habits because, well, I'll get to that in just a minute, but on the website, then each of these sections, each of these habits has their own section, their own page, and then you can look into it, and there's illustrations, there's an essay on the mark. Each mark is taken up by a different author, and they also have, like I said, illustrations and discussion questions and scripture references. It's very rich, and It is great for individual or churches to use, like adult forum or adult Bible study. This is my book here, and I know you can't really see it from where you are, but I've had to tape the cover back on a couple of times, and then a couple pages in, and tape a couple pages as well. And every page, I think, is marked at least a half a dozen times. It's very rich, very enriching for me. And then, yep, 8habits.org. Sorry, I had two of those in there. This is along with, on the website, along with all the other material. Each section has the author on video discussing the topic as well. So they go into greater depth about it, and they take some questions and answers about it. So it's an amazing resource to be able to use with congregations, or with, like I said, but personal enrichment. And I want to begin unfolding and unpacking the 8 habits using a quick little video from Dr. Ray Jones, who is the director of TFE. And it's playing, I know it is, but it's slow.
It's
There we
good
go.
to see you, and I'm so glad that you are engaging the resource 8 Habits of Evangelism. You all know this. Things have changed. They have radically changed. COVID-19 and rampant racism have caused us to rethink the church. But I know what you're thinking. We have been rethinking the church for a good while now. We really have. Because basically, we are no longer on the radar of people in our neighborhoods. For the most part, people just are not waking up like on Sunday mornings and thinking, hey, if that church down the road just had its act together, we'd get up and go to worship. Things have radically changed. Therefore, there's a shift in the way in which we do ministry, especially the way in which we are about evangelism. Evangelism can no longer be about just simply getting more people to come to our churches, even though we do want that, we do want to grow. And evangelism can no longer just simply be about going to heaven when we die. And oh my goodness, eternal life is such a gift, and we are so grateful, but it cannot be just about that. So what is evangelism? Well, evangelism is simply sharing and bearing witness to the good news of the gospel. The good news of the gospel is all about God's loving purpose, that we would love God, that we would love one another, and that we would care for this good earth. And this good news of the gospel is actually in Jesus Christ, in his life, death, and resurrection. I love the way the prophet Isaiah puts good news. He writes, beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news, who proclaim peace, who bring good tidings, who proclaim salvation. So what is this good news? This good tidings, this peace, this shalom was actually the wholeness of God. It's the notion that all is well. It's the righteousness of God. It's the justice of God. It's that God is righting ancient wrongs. And when it comes to Jesus, we experience this wholeness, this well-being in his life and his death and his resurrection. And the cool thing about Jesus is that everyone was accepted. He turned away no one. And when people encountered Jesus, they experienced healing, and they were always on a path of wholeness. and well-being. My mentor in seminary remained a friend beyond seminary. And when I was first discerning the call whether to work for the denomination or not, and to work for the denomination office of evangelism, I contacted Ben Johnson and said, "What do you think?" And I'll never forget his words. He said, "Ray, I can see you doing this." He said, "But I've been doing evangelism for the denomination for a good long while now. And I have learned something. You cannot train people to share something that is not within them. You cannot train people to share good news that is not already within them." And I thought to myself, that is so true. I don't need to be trained to tell you about my dog Jane, who is right behind me. I don't need to be trained to tell you the good news about our two daughters. I just don't need to be trained to share that good news because it is within me. And then Ben went on to say, "Ray, what you need to do is help people grow in their faith, grow as followers of Jesus, grow as disciples. Discipleship formation is the key." And that's why I'm excited about this resource, 8 Habits of Evangelism. We're going to have the opportunity to go more deeply into our relationship with God, our relationships with one another, and our relationships with people around us. I'm excited that we're going to go more deeply into these 8 habits: radical welcome, worship, the sacraments, prayer, justice, teaching, fellowship, and generosity. And I believe that what will happen is that we will go more deeply into our love of God. And when that happens, we go more deeply into this notion that we are loved. And as we're in relationship with people, they go more deeply into this notion that they are loved. And then we go more deeply into this notion that we matter, our lives matter, and in relationship with others, they then have the opportunity to go more deeply into the notion that their lives matter. And then we have the opportunity to go more deeply into this strong notion that we belong. And that in a relationship with others, they also have the opportunity to know that they belong as well. And what if this is what the church was about? That people knew that they were loved, and that they wanted, and they belonged. I believe the world would change. And it would be like that old hymn, that old song. They will know that we are Christians by our love. Yes, they will know that we are Christians by our love. I hope this is a good and beautiful journey for you as you engage the 8 habits of evangelism. Just know that you're going to be in our prayers as you engage this resource. And you experience your lives changing. And I know that we will discover our own stories of transformation and discover that we're in the story of God's transformation with Jesus. And we will have a story to share with the people around us about how God has changed our lives and is changing the life of this world. So thank you for the opportunity to go through this resource together. And I hope all goes well. Amen.
So again, these are the 8 habits that we'll be just going over briefly today. One of the things I really enjoyed about Ray's piece, and this is kind of how we'll structure the remaining part of the presentation, is that each time we'll discuss, we'll go over, sorry, I'm just trying to keep track of time here. We'll go over a different mark. I'll share with you one of the things that I found that was interesting, and then we'll lift up the habits, because each of the habits have sub-habits on how to live them out and how to grow them and how to do them. And then we'll discuss a couple of discussion questions. So what I found interesting and what really resonated with me about Ray's preamble, as they call it, is the that he did not need to be taught about sharing the good news of his kids. And for me, my son is 11, and I remember when he was born, or when my wife was pregnant, I couldn't wait to share. It was just such amazing news to be able to share with other people, and to I was just so excited about it. And likewise, when I met my wife, I was so excited to have met her, and she was just this wonderful person. I couldn't stop telling people about her, and that's the way that's what Ray is talking about, is that these habits, is that evangelism, the good news, isn't going out and sharing a pathway to salvation. It's sharing the good news. It's that as we live our lives, we can't help but share what's going on, because it's such good news to us, because we have such an amazing relationship with Christ, with God, and with our community. One of the things Ray says in the written part of the preamble is, over time, these habits change us and offer discernment and guidance for following Jesus through the trials, structures, and systems of our nation and world. These habits enable us to hear God's voice over all other voices, calling out to be heard. To me, yeah. So what, Cordelia, was there anything in that, or is there anything in that passage or that quote that stands out to you?
Oh, in this quote?
Yeah, in this one.
I was still thinking of what Reverend Jones was saying about that you can't train people to teach something that's not already within them. I guess that was a Ben Johnson quote, and that people are not choosing to stay away until we do worship or programs better. Those comments really are really sticking with me there. Let's see, but what you have here, absolutely, when we become more peaceful, gracious, generous people, then that radiates, and that is very attracting, not just attractive, but attracting. And I think that we often don't create situations in which it's possible for people to actually get to know one another or have real conversations. And that's where this kind of thing happens, where we can give one another a listening ear and maybe a different perspective, and maybe just the right word for that person in that moment as the Holy Spirit gives it to you.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. For me, it was I thought about developing habits. And I thought about, Cheryl and I were talking on the way here about our time working in newspaper or news. I used to work in newspapers, and Cheryl used to work in newsrooms on the radio. And I was a photographer. And today we have people everybody has a camera on their phone, and everybody can take a picture. But there's still a difference between having a picture of an event and having a professional come and take a photo. For me, those things develop over time, just like somebody who's learning to play basketball, or somebody who's learning art, or a musician. In a previous life, I was a photographer, and I used to see things differently. So a photograph that one person would take, and I would take it a different way. Just because everybody has a digital camera doesn't mean they're taking a professional picture. And you were saying something? Somebody was?
Just appreciating. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. I just want to make sure I wasn't leaving somebody out there. So the idea here is that as we develop these habits, they become ways of seeing things differently. So on the left, or one of the differences between both of the photos, the way she sees things now, this is a professional photographer, and as you can tell, the compositions are similar, but it's really about lighting. It's about how, how the subject is centered and where they are. And those things she sees things a little bit differently now and is able to use her skills a little bit differently. And it comes out in a new way. The first time you do something, you're not really gonna succeed at it likely. So it's developing the habits. And the first habit that I want to dive into here, and I want to be aware of giving us some time for a break in a little bit. The first one is radical welcome, and it's written by Shania Leonard. And they identify as they, them. And they are an amazing speaker. One of the things Shania talks about is that it's not just putting in lip service. It's about getting out and making sure your congregations or your communities are ready to actually welcome. Have they done the work? Or do they know how to interact and how to react to somebody who's shown up? So one of the quotes that stood out to me in this section was that radical welcome is beyond just the spirit of hospitality or the presence of a visitor's coming and going on the morning after worship. It's not just a sign that says all are welcome. She talks about this in the video clip, that oftentimes the signs on churches that say all are welcome are really more of a laughing point for the LGBTQIA plus community, because they find them comical, because it's really more of lip service than it is about people actually being welcomed. I did work with a congregation once that instead of saying they were a welcoming community, they said they were becoming a welcoming community. And that was one that worked for them and worked better for the community, is that it showed a sense of communication, a conversation, and an effort to have a dialogue. As I was thinking about this, I immediately thought about this community in this nonprofit in my community that was trying to wanted to have a tiny house village for those experiencing homelessness. And they were going to be radically welcoming and open, and everybody was going to be included. And one of the things, as we talked with them, in my previous role before here, I did social work, and she said, yeah, we're going to be open and welcoming, and everybody can come. It doesn't matter if you're LGBTQ plus or part of the BIPOC community, or anything like that. Everybody's welcome. And the more we talked to them, it was everybody's welcome, but we're not going to deal with the pronouns. The pronouns, that's just silly. We're just not going to deal with the pronouns. Everybody's just going to go with the pronoun that they have. And so it really became this idea, it became known in the among social workers, that this really wasn't going to be what they thought it was. And it never really got off the ground, and has stalled for a few years now. Anybody have any experience with radical welcome in their communities? And what has worked or what has not worked?
Well, I appreciate you're talking about that congregation that said they're trying to become a welcoming church, because the honest truth of it is that our church has differences of opinion in our membership. There are people that are very welcoming, and there are people that are very uncomfortable, especially as you move beyond LGBTQ, but transgender and the use of pronouns, and sometimes people, as they are expressing their discomfort or their shock at new ways of trying to be polite, that they'll say things that are hurtful. And I understand the comment about many LGBTQ people feeling like it's a joke, but at the same time, whenever you're introduced to something very new that you don't have any experience with, it can be difficult to show accepting welcome when
Yeah.
it's your first time, when it's very different.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very good. That's very true. Yeah. Our brains are pattern makers, and they like to have patterns and categories. And when things don't fit in a pattern or a category, it kind of confuses us. That's a very good point. So Shania lays out some habits to develop the habit of radical welcome. Develop a plan that all can participate in. Don't always expect them to come to you. Having a sign, like I said, isn't actually getting people in the door. It's just a sign that tells people some words. You might have to go out and get them. Reflect diversity in who leads rather. Make sure you have representation there with actual voice. Worship should not always be how it always has been. Different cultures, different ethnicities, different gender identities have different ways of worshiping. For some, saying God as He is not going to work for them at all. And some saying God as She is not going to work for them at all. So how do we work those things together? And then do your own work, of course. Make sure you're feeling, where you stand, and you've thought about the things and worked on them. And even if you don't win on the first time, don't give up. I love Shania, and I love the way she talks. Sometimes she can get a little bit deep in how she says things, but really it's don't give up if you don't make it the first time. And because of time here, that we're already 48 minutes into our presentation, we'll kind of go over the questions just to give you an idea of what the questions are, rather than have a feedback on this one. So one of the 5 questions she comes up with for a discussion is, in what ways have you practiced radical welcome in your faith community? And another one she asks is, how have you prepared personally to engage in connection with those who have been othered? So if we were to have a line between us and somebody else, or those who are not included, how have we begun to engage those who have been othered?
Question.
We'll do worship. Go ahead. Sorry.
That's a great question, and that's an important question.
Yeah, it is.
I guess one of the things that I really realize is how hard it is for a lot of folks who have been in a church that has not changed much for a long time to get to that point. And I mean, to some degree, you have to engage with people who maybe you didn't even realize felt othered, and see them as children of God before you can even grasp how isolated and excluded they have felt. So I guess I just sometimes feel like, how can we be gentle with folks who are really well-intentioned, and not try to force them to be welcoming in a realm that has been presented to them in the media from a very politicized perspective. I think there are very many people who would be gentler and kinder if they hadn't been exposed to so much from the media that has been labeled as political. And I'm afraid that even inclusion, which is a Christian concept, has become identified as political. And that's scares people, and that they also feel like, I think they feel like a lot of communities, churches are actually becoming politicized and, you know, being asked to identify with one or the other perspective in order for people to feel comfortable. So
Mhm.
I don't know. I'm really struggling here.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you that it is not a solo struggle. It is a struggle that many pastors are experiencing, and pastors in Florida and pastors in Minnesota. My wife and I talk about this all the time. We live in a fairly, Minnesota is a fairly blue state overall, but our county is extremely red. And so we have a bunch of those dynamics as well that are hard to deal with and hard to understand. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for sharing. Bruce Reyes Chow writes the essay on worship, and yeah, I absolutely I met him for the first time a few weeks ago at a conference, and I just am very infatuated with the man and the way his mind works. He's an interesting guy. Right away from the beginning, he grabbed my attention with this prayer. I love the way he talks about God here. God of the chaos, in the confines of a binary and calcified world, grant us the courage to embrace nuance in ourselves and others, awaken humility that manifests generosity towards things we do not understand, unleash the creativity of souls that expands our experience of you, and strengthen our resolve to persevere through the messiness of seeking justice in the world. This we pray. Amen. I love that, in the confines of a binary and calcified world. And he takes that further and talks about how, as we approach worship post or towards the end of the pandemic, or after the pandemic has begun and is in place for quite a while now, how do we worship, and what are our practices? At this time, the basic instinct of most pastors could be to go back to normal of most churches. We don't know how to include online worship, or if we should include it, or what does it look like, or does it even make sense to keep doing it? And he talks about this dichotomy, the false dichotomy of choice that we're forced to make. He talks about it there in the last sentence. As we settle into our digital and online worship, I hope we all choose to reject false dichotomies as a justification for stagnation, and instead choose to embrace nuance. For him, coming through the pandemic and still, like I said, in the midst of it, it wasn't about trying to choose one or the other, but how can we blend? And his habits really talk about that as well. He talks about, for worship, ways to develop that would be to reimagine rather than replicate. So rather than trying to redo exactly what you did pre-pandemic, try to reimagine that. Add more seats to the table instead of taking seats away between a false choice between online or digital. Can you add them together? Can you do the worship service hybrid? And then he says to think like a DJ. And for that, he teases out the notion that DJs are all about environment. They're all about, if you've been to a big wedding, there's smoke, there's lights, there's lasers, there's fog, there's all sorts of things to create an environment and make it welcoming and make it engaging for everybody. So he encourages those habits to develop. And some of the questions he lifts up, and I'm sorry, I'm going to take just a second here. I want to try to pop up the participant list again. It disappeared from my screen, so I want to see those people. So give me just a second here because I can't remember everybody's name. There we go. And I can't see the chat either, so there you go. Thank you. All right. So as we look at worship here, as we look at worship, what have you learned about yourself as a congregation, as participants, or as leaders during this time of pandemic? What has surprised you about how you have navigated a season of life together? Linnell, how are things going at your church for hybrid worship, or do you have hybrid worship?
Michael can probably answer that better. He's online listening. I'm sorry, I had to step out. I didn't hear your
Oh, no,
question.
that's okay. That's right. That's right.
I had to take some medicine. So what was your question? I apologize.
The question was, how has worship been for you guys now towards the tail end of this pandemic, hopefully? How has that been for you guys with worship being hybrid or in person or online, or
Right.
what has that been like for you?
Well, we've been, I guess, very fortunate. We have 3 services, and we've, now that we have come back, we are continuing those 3 unique services for different congregations, and but we're still struggling. We do a very good live streaming, but we're finding that not that many people come, and we're just struggling with either or and but without and we're just sort of evolving out of COVID. And I like what was said earlier is about taking things and putting them in and out of the box. We just read a book recently, and it talks about using an example of a Christmas tree and how you collect ornaments for years and years and years and years, and you can't put them all back on the Christmas tree. And so which ones do you put on this year and save some for next year? And some programs and things that we've tried to do in the past, it's not that they're bad, but a lot of people want to go back to where we were 2 or 3 years ago, and some things work and some don't. And what are some new things that we can add on and perhaps put a few things back in the box to rethink about the future?
I love that illustration of the Christmas tree and ornaments. I absolutely love that. Yeah. I grew up in a family.
We wanted to have our session bring all of their things and opportunities and programs that they're involved with to one meeting and put a blank Christmas tree up and say, okay, which ones are we going to put on this year?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that is brilliant.
It'd make a great visual.
Yeah, it really would. It would. Oh my gosh. I'm going to have to remember that. Okay.
I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it's a perfect answer for how things are working. Is we're kind of still figuring it out. We don't really know yet. And I think that's great to be in the mindset of always becoming, and always evaluating. That's a good mindset to be in. And things aren't going to be the same like they were pre-pandemic, because life isn't the same. So yeah, that's great that you guys are doing it. Why don't we take about a 5-minute break